Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game faction focus for Qapu Khalqi, the Corsairs of the Gate. In this video, we'll be talking about who QK are, how they play, what are their strengths, weaknesses, and faction identity before jumping into Infinity Army to go through many of the profiles that showcase the sectoral. Now, QK have kind of come into N5 as a faction whose time has almost come. They were historically a faction that kind of languished a little bit in the optimistically B minus C plus kind of region. And I am certainly on record in previous editions saying that they weren't really for me, but which benefited a lot from many of the changes that happened in N5. Some of these were rules changes or general balance changes. For example, the fact that every combat jump trooper also picked up jet propulsion has been hugely beneficial to Yarn-Yarns, which are a core element of QK as a faction. But they also benefited a lot just from general stat changes and balance changes, changes to different profiles, and really significantly from the adoption of even just one particular unit from Foreign Company when it got dissolved and spread out across other factions in the form of Lashmi, who introduced a hacking device plus into a faction that otherwise lacked it. And that change to capability alone was almost enough to go, okay, there is definitely something to QK now in terms of being well-rounded, with lots of different options and lots of different unit types and the link teams that have always been part of QK's makeup, right? The original Haris team faction. What they were lacking from the beginning of N5 was a real selling point or key piece unit. And that's something that has just recently changed with the Iguana rework. Now, we will talk about the Iguana when we get into Infinity Army, but in short, it's really good. It's a really, really good and unique tag. And while there is no way that you can say any 66-point model is a true auto-include because in any given list, just because there will always be scenarios and situations where you might not be able to fit that in order to accomplish different objectives, it is really, really cool. And it does find its way into many QK lists, and it will be in the QK list that we showcase at the end of this video. And with the change to the Iguana profile, Qapu Khalqi now has a selling point regimen. Hey, do you want to play the Iguana? Well, to do that, you have to play one of these two factions, Corregidor or QK. And so now, QK is in that wonderful position where it has a hook, it has a selling point piece in the form of the Iguana, but then there is so much more to build out in terms of a broad and well-rounded faction with a surprisingly wide suite of different capabilities. And so where is QK now at time of recording in N5? Well, it's a very good generalist faction. It has a hugely flexible fire team configuration setup where it can make multiple small fire teams with that really idealized gun and specialist and something kind of setup. And it can fit tons of stuff into a list because most of the models that you have access to in QK that are particularly attractive are a bit like the Iguana, where yes, they're kind of below the top of the curve in terms of many of their attributes, but they are efficient. And because they are efficient, they're just a little bit cheaper than you might expect because there's some compromise they make in the profile. Maybe they're bad at dodging, maybe their armor is a bit lower than you might expect, maybe their ballistic skill is a little lower than you expect, but they aren't paying extra points, so they're a little cheaper so you can afford more, and that gives you a really wide range of what you can fit, not just in the faction at large, but in a specific list. And to kind of showcase this a little bit, I sat down when thinking about this video and just wrote out the things that were cool about our QK list that I wanted to show off. And that list of things about that list that's cool is really long. Like just to rattle off a number of virtues. This list is fast, dangerous, and has a resilient tag. This list can do deployable spam, or it has a ballistic skill 14 mine dispenser and a linked picture and baggage to reload both. It's a 15 order list plus NCO and attack aware, letting it get to 17 orders regularly, which is a really, really healthy order count. It's got 3 pretty decent quality guns of different types, including a linked Azrael, which is an absolute cannon that anything in the game should be scared of. It's got a really complete deployment zone repeater net coverage for defensive purposes. It's got 3 hackers with a really good hacking mix of killer hacking and regular hacking, including that really important one hacker with combat instinct just to get past stealth and force your opponent to do reset AROs. It's got smoke and white noise and the ability to put gunfire through each of those to take advantage of different kinds of visibility modifier shooting. It's got multiple warbands. It's got a willpower 17 Doctor. It's got a willpower 14 infiltrating camouflage specialist. It's got a shell game to hide the lieutenant, and it's got multiple small efficient fire teams with a gun and a specialist in every team. Holy shit, that's a really, really good list. And you can fit all of that in 300 points in QK. Now, there are compromises, right? I'm selling it there, but the faction and the list are not without limitations. But if you like that really broad base, multiple fire teams, multiple capabilities kind of list, QK can do that, and that is powerful in this edition. Now, let's talk about some of the limitations that Qapu Khalqi face as a faction. As I mentioned, they're not the top of the curve in too many places. Quite a few models are going to have like one less in a stat somewhere than might be ideal. Maybe it's just one less ballistic skill, like Jambazan's or ballistic skill 12. Maybe it's a few points less of BTS. Almost all of your hackers in Qapu Khalqi are going to be BTS 3 or even BTS 0. Only Lashmi is a BTS 6 hacker. There is virtually no like 6-2 move in this faction. Janissaries are fantastic, but they're 4-4. Azrael are 4-4. So you're not moving really, really efficiently around the board. So all of the like showcase stats that you might see on truly elite pieces in other factions, we're not getting those in QK, but we're more than making up for that with efficiency. It's also a faction with a very limited kind of like N3 legacy midfield. You've got Al Hawar and now Samsa. And there are real limits to those pieces. I like them, right? I like Al Hawar and I like Samsa. But the midfield that we can build with Qapu Khalqi is just not in the same realm as factions that can do it genuinely well. Particularly in terms of mine layers, right? I like Hawar Forward Observers and Hawar Hackers. It makes good use of their willpower 14. But the mine layer profiles on Hawar are bloated with weapons in particular that you maybe don't want to take full advantage of with a ballistic skill 11 gunfighting trooper. It's also a faction that doesn't really have any outstanding defensive elements. Now, you've got access to total reaction bots and willpower 14 engineers, and that's totally fine. But we aren't building a minefield that I'm in love with. Frankly, my favorite mine layer in the faction is Lashmi, and that's a cyber mine in your deployment zone. And one of the compromises that you make when you focus on those like Haris style of teams is that often your active gun gets pressed into service as a reactive weapon of desperation. Now, something like an Azrael in a fire team is still a weapon that your opponent absolutely has to respect taking a hit from, but it's not a dedicated defensive piece. It's not a Neurokinetics Black Air or something like that. You are often having to use weapons that you would prefer be active turn firepower pieces as reactive pieces to slow your opponent down and contest their movement through the midfield, and that comes at a little bit of a cost. It's also a faction, particularly a faction modeled on the Barbary Corsairs, with possibly the worst close combat in the game. Now, that is something that it is totally okay to sacrifice. Close combat attacks in Infinity are not something that you need to win the game, but there are a bunch of dudes with swords in Qapu Khalqi, and you would be forgiven for thinking that this is a faction that wants to get into close combat. And in fact, if you go into army and you filter by martial arts, you'll find that you can't, because there's nothing with martial arts in the entire faction. There is some CC22 stuff in the form of Yan-Yans with no modifiers. You might occasionally get a Corsan into close combat in hopes of doing something, but the best close combatant in the entire faction is Scarface, and we aren't taking him particularly much. So it's just kind of a thing to be aware of, that the most you will use close combat for most of the time in Qapu Khalqi is running into close combat with a Yan-Yan and taking a CC attack if they dodge, and even then there's a fairly good chance you might just fire your heavy pistol instead. Finally, this is still a faction, as much as the balance changes have benefited them in the shift from N4 to N5, that has a bunch of what I might call historic deadweight profiles. Now, I want to caveat that with this is my perspective as a bit of a faction tourist. I play everything in Infinity. There is no faction that I would just never play for any reason. And even though I've played half a dozen Qapu Khalqi games in the lead up to doing this video, I haven't done what you might call like really deep learning and trying out every single available profile. If you are the kind of person, if you're watching this and you are a long time QK Fat player, there's a really good chance that you actually are the kind of person who has put the yards in and can tell me those occasions when, you know what, actually, in this specific circumstance, odalisks are good. And in this specific circumstance, Kaplan Tactical are good. But my appraisal as a bit of a faction tourist is that there is still a little bit of a chunk in this faction of stuff that you just don't really need to bother with and which are a distraction from the cool and interesting things. That includes Kaplan, that includes Odalisks. Frankly, it includes most of the Corsan profiles, for example. And that's just something to be aware of when you're approaching the faction from new, or if you are someone who thinks that QK might be interested and you're about to start getting into them, perhaps because this video is selling them a little bit, just be aware that there is a chunk of the faction that maybe you will want to get to later on, because to start with, there really isn't that much of a place for models like Odalisks in your list. Now, happily, there is still plenty of other incredible stuff, and we'll be going through a lot of it as we dive through Army, as we go through, in depth, this well-rounded, wide capability spectrum Haqqislam faction. Now, as usual, we're going to start with fire teams, and that is very apropos in Qapu Khalqi because it is absolutely an interesting fire team faction, but we're going to skip past the traditional line infantry, which in QK would be Ghulam. I like Ghulam a lot, but QK is not a Ghulam faction. There is nothing particularly compelling about the Ghulam fire teams. In particular, there's no real way to get an impressive gun into Ghulam fire teams in QK. And so, for that reason and others, they're basically just outcompeted thoroughly by other much more interesting options. And those interesting options start with, totally unsurprisingly, the Havsa unit. Now, Havsa, in terms of their general profiles, they're okay. There's a few here that we would call out. 20 points for a Hollow Mask chain of command is by no means the worst thing in the world. The Lieutenant is a Hollow Mask Lieutenant with Willpower 14, which has got plenty of space and which you will often take in QK. The fact that you can have a Silhouette 2 linkable Hollow Mask Lieutenant who really does not give away his presence terribly much at all is really nice and one of the selling points of the faction. You should probably be taking the Havsa LT kinda as the default a lot of the time in Qapu Khalqi. And I'm also a personal enjoyer of the Forward Observer just because it's randomly another deployable repeater. And while I've gotten quite a lot of use out of this guy in vanilla Haqqislam, he's got some play in Qapu Khalqi as well. Now, all of that, okay, cool. These individual profiles, you might even occasionally take any of the SWC ones because this is still a ballistic skill 12 unit. It's armor 2. It's not the worst stat line in the world. And a surprise heavy rocket launcher assault pistol, for example, could have some play in some games. But the real thing about Havsa, the really important thing about Havsa, is how they fit into Qapu Khalqi fire teams, because you can have 4 of these guys as wildcards, and they count as all of Ghulams, Odalisks, Sekbans, and Janissaries, which means that every single fire team you run in Qapu Khalqi can easily have, at bare minimum, the bonus for having 2 of the same troop type in a fire team. And just to do a quick rules explanation, because this feels like something that does get asked quite a lot, the name of a fire team, for example, Qapu Khalqi fire team or Druz Bayram security fire team, does not determine what you have to be counting in terms of troops of the same type. You just count the troop with the highest number of troops of that type, and that sets your fire team bonuses. Which means a lot of the time in Qapu Khalqi, we will have a fire team that consists of, for example, an Azrael, which counts as nothing, and say Layla Sharif, who counts as a Ghulam, and a Havsa unit, who also counts as a Ghulam. That's therefore a fire team that is considered to have 2 Ghulam in it, even though you can't have Ghulam infantry in a Qapu Khalqi fire team, and this isn't a Ghulam fire team, it is still a fire team with 2 of the same troop type in it, and that tremendous flexibility, particularly when combined with other wild cards, is how you just build fire teams on a dime in this faction. The Havsa unit is one of the core building blocks, and they are not particularly expensive, and they do some interesting things with Hollow Mask, and they conceal your lieutenant, and the optimal number in most fire teams actually is 1, but it's 1 alongside any of the other really cool fire teams, wildcards that exist. So as we go through all of the different fire teams that you can build in QK, bear in mind that almost all of them will work based on one really cool model with a gun, one cool wildcard or wildcard equivalent, and then one Hafsa who rounds the Link team out with a relatively cheap model with a rifle and a light shotgun and a little bit of surprise, not surprise in the surprise attack sense, but just wildcard shell games in the form of Hollow Mask, and gets you that hugely flexible composition with low opportunity cost, thanks to how QK Fire teams are structured. So that's the Havsa, but there are a bunch of wildcards that we have to talk through before we even get to the kind of like core building blocks or big gun pieces. And so the second of these wildcards that we want to think about QK Fire teams in the context of is Lashmi, Hacker of Fortune. Now, she's a wildcard. She can join any fire team, and she counts as an Odalisk. Havsa also count as Odalisks. We can sort of see how this is coming together now. And she's really, really solid. There are technically more efficient hacking device pluses in the game, but like not many and not by much. Uhahu I would potentially take over Lashmi if given a choice, but I am very happy with her. She's Willpower 14 and BTS 6, excellent. She's linkable, excellent. She's even got Mimetism, which is weirdly difficult, makes just like a weirdly interesting little upgrade, but more importantly, she has a pitcher and she's linkable, fantastic, and she has Mine Layer and Cyber Mines, fantastic, a little bit of deployment zone defense. At 24 points, she gives you hacking device plus stuff, the most important of which is white noise, in addition to just being a well-rounded Willpower 14 hacker who takes care of your network projection thanks to being a linked pitcher. She is in, I think, probably all of my QK lists, because I can staple her to any big gun alongside something like a Havsa Lieutenant and have a backfield support fire team that's handling my network projection and doing a little bit of light hacking and just generally being really high utility. I like her a lot, and she's one of the really big changes for QK in N5 because the addition of white noise means that you can do smoke shooting in inverted commas against models with marksmanship and MSV, and do actual smoke shooting through smoke against models without those things. And that gives you just good gunfighting, all things considered. You should always be able to put your opponent on some kind of a negative modifier and control visibility and move around the board. And those are just highly valuable things to have. Do not skip out on Lashmi. Now, the next wildcard to talk about for similar reasons is Hussam operative Layla Sharif. Now, I've spoken about her virtues on other videos. She's a killer hacker with Carbonite and Combat Instinct, which means she's a really good addition to any hacking network because she can do things like add a second or a third hacker that does killer hacking duties but also has an ARO against other hackable stuff. And because she's got Combat Instinct, she negates enemy stealth, which means that your hacking network is live, even, for example, against a Sujan who's been given stealth thanks to the most recent ITS, Seasonal Rules, Stealth Operations. And that's just an extremely valuable force contribution. Now, at 22 points and only BTS 3, even with her firewall, which is really nice, she's not a true high watermark hacker, particularly given her cost, but she can do an absolute ton of classifieds, and she counts as a Ghulam when she joins a fire team. And Havsa also count as Ghulams, which means if you want to, you can have any fire team rounded out by Layla Sharif and a Havsa and whatever other one piece you would like. That's really cool, but she is also an element that I'm actually quite willing to just take by herself, maybe duo her with an Iguana or something, because of the effect she has on force multiplying your network, which you are projecting with a combination of models with repeaters and the linked picture from Lashmi. Now, the next wildcard to mention is a Burkut. You can have two of these in any given fire team, and they count as Sekban. Remember, Havsas also count as Sekban, although you may occasionally find that Burkut are just okay enough to take as an element by themselves. Now, I have not been including them a huge amount in N5, in QK at least. I've tried them a little bit in Hack Islam. And that's mostly because we are getting a little pricey here. These are heavy infantry, they are costed appropriately, they are only ballistic skill 12, but I am always here for a boarding shotgun +1 burst, particularly when we add link bonuses to it, and these guys are native specialists thanks to being engineers, and just have a whole grab bag of additional skills. You could actually consider taking, say, a Birdcut and a Sekban and a big gun in a link team, skipping the Havsa entirely and having just some really premier close assault with things like the boarding shotgun profile. But 28 points on the boarding shotgun +1 burst is getting up into that points cost where we begin to have to cut other things from a list. And so the cost here is just a tiny little bit high. Tolerable in some cases. They will find their way into lists, but if you're going to be paying for a Burkut, you need to really have a plan to move that fire team forward and take advantage of their close assault potential. You can't just use these guys as 26-point corner guards. And because they're 4-4 and they will usually be in a link that is comprised entirely of 4-4 troops, you need to have a very specific plan for how you're moving that fire team around. It can't just be a movement of opportunity, because that will result in a position in many games where you're wasting the points you spent on the Burkut and they're just a little bit too expensive for that. Still a unit to bear in mind, and a wildcard that can combine with many other wildcards to good effect. Now, not technically a wildcard, but they may as well be because they appear in every fire team that we are going to be talking about, are Sekban, Naval Special Unit. Now, these guys are a very slightly bloated profile. They're paying for Armor 3 and BTS 3 despite being on a 1-wound model. They have the dreaded 360 visor. They're paying for Terrain 0G. There are a fair few guns on them that you maybe don't really want to be trying and taking advantage of with a Ballistic Skill 13. Well, Ballistic Skill 13 is not terrible, but they're single wound troops with no visibility modifiers. You don't really want to be gunfighting with these guys, and so frankly, quite a lot of these profiles we can just sort of dispense with and not think too much about. We are not here for the Sekban Spitfire. We're not even really here for the Sekban Heavy Rocket Launcher, despite the fact that it's 19 points. What we are here for, primarily, is the Sekban Doctor, or even just the 19-point boarding shotgun Sekban. Because if you do have to close assault, a linked boarding shotgun and a burst 2 chain colt is one of the ways to do it, but more importantly, they are cheap and useful additions to a fire team. They count, obviously, as Sekban, and Havsa and Burkuts both also count as Sekban, and they are NCOs. In Qapu Khalqi, you will very often be taking a non-active lieutenant. It'll be something like a Hafsa, pretending to be something else, sitting in a fire team somewhere safely without any real plans to contribute much to the game at any point, apart from having a usefully concealed identity. And that means that the first NCO that you put in any given list is a free extra order, and 19 or 23 points for that, that's extremely worthwhile as part of a fire team composition. And so, despite the fact that, yeah, Sekban profiles are a little bit bloated, the first Sekban in a list is high value, and if we're going to be taking one anyway, well, a Willpower 17 Doctor is really useful. So let's avail ourselves of that. It's an expense I'm kind of willing to bear because the sum total of the benefits that it gives you is well worth the points cost. Some Reforced Reconstitution, particularly if you're doing things like teaming it with an Azrael and a Havsa, is really worthwhile because an Azrael's going to want a little bit of help some of the time, brute forcing his way through face-to-face rolls. And it adds a specialist to a list. There's a link rather. There's just a whole bunch of reasons why one Sekban, really good addition to any given list. Now, there are some other wild cards that you can theoretically add to QK lists, but they aren't wild cards that add a troop type. For example, Rouhani doesn't count as anything, the Corsan doesn't count as anything. So it's the Havsa, the Burkut, Layla, Lashmi, and kind of the Sekban. Those are our polyvalent building blocks. We're going to combine those with some kind of a cool gun. And in terms of cool guns, we start with the Special Deterrence Group Azrael. Now, these form the basis of a Qapu Khalqi fire team, along with some other different options. And what a gun, my goodness. Limitations, just to note. Ballistic Skill 13, no visual modifiers, no immunity to any modifiers, just Ballistic Skill 13. However, Ballistic Skill Attack SR-1, Ballistic Skill Attack Continuous Damage, and your choice of a Burst 3 Feuerback or an AP Heavy Machine Gun. This is a cannon to kill God, and even a Jotun has to be scared of being borne down on by one of these things. I have tested both of these profiles, and I've got a little bit of time for each. The Ballistic Skill Attack +1 Burst Azrael, if you can afford the extra points, I do kind of like, because that +1 Burst doesn't apply just to the Feuerback, it also applies to the Chain Rifle and AP Heavy Pistol, which means that you can push this guy up the board and use him as a close assault piece, because if he rounds the corner, your opponent is staring down either Burst 2, BS Attack SR-1, BS Attack Continuous Damage Chain Rifle, or all of those same modifiers and the Link Team Special die on the AP Heavy Pistol. At short range, that AP heavy pistol on the Feuerback Azrael is rolling 3 dice and 1 special dice, and is damage 5 armor piercing continuous, which again is a piece that can kill a Jotun at short range. There are not many guns like that in the game. However, having gone back and forth between the two, I do think the default I am more likely to take is the AP heavy machine gun. There are two reasons why. The first is that it is 4 points cheaper. That's actually quite a lot of points that adds up over the course of a game, and because it's continuous damage and damage 4, I'm still comfortable using that as an ARO piece if I need to. Anything that is scared of the Feuerback does still also need to be scared of taking one hit and failing multiple saves against the APHMG. The other reason is that Burst is still Burst, right? Burst 5 is still more than Burst 4. And because the Azrael is rolling at Ballistic Skill 13 with really no modifiers apart from maybe shooting through white noise against a marksmanship or visor trooper, even with diminishing returns from extra dice once you get past a certain number, I'm still more comfortable having the burst 5 or burst 4+1 than the burst 3+1 on the Feuerback. Just anecdotally, having played with both profiles, I am running Qapu Khalqi as an efficiency-centric army. The 4 extra points can go a very long way in terms of making upgrades to certain things, and it's got just that marginally higher chance of winning a face-to-face roll in active turn. Both are still very good pieces though. Even with the addition of the Iguana to QK, you still want linked firepower pieces that are threatening to theoretically anything. And when the Azrael connects, it's just a power fantasy in terms of the damage that it can do. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, but also part of a Qapu Khalqi fire team, we have a Janbazan. Now, these guys come with the really significant caveat that they are ballistic skill 12. Even the heavy machine gun, firing 4 dice plus 1 special die, it is very easy to have ballistic skill 12 let you down or take a little bit longer to secure a kill than you would like. But smoke shooting is still really good in N5, and these are the things that you have access to if you want to do smoke shooting, and it is very easy to have a fire team that consists, for example, Group 2, Jambazan Heavy Machine Gun, Lashmi, and a Hafsa. That gets you the special die bonus from fire team size because the team has 2 obelisks in it. And provided you are shooting through smoke at a target that doesn't really like shooting back, spray and pray will get you some connections with that heavy machine gun. And having done that, there are a few things about the Janbazan that are still cool and interesting. Shock immunity and regeneration on 13s is actually really kind of neat and forces your opponent, if they put 1 wound in the Janbazan, to try and find a way to put a 2nd wound in, because you do know that they will come back 2/3 of the time otherwise. And Armor 3 is just enough to occasionally spang return fire from something like a Thunderbolt that gets lucky and crits. And finally, Warhorse is a very relevant skill. There's quite a few models in the game that might be trying to apply a negative modifier to you in reactive with ballistic skill attack -3 in the hopes of dropping even smoke shooting ballistic skill down. So for example, something like a Hetkari shooter. You smoke shoot a Hetkari shooter and it will usually return fire because it's got ballistic skill attack -3. But the Janbazan comfortably ignores that, and between Warhorse and Multispectral Visor level 2, the only skills that can impact a negative modifier on the Janbazan are Albedo and equivalent. That's really solid. It means that the Ballistic Skill 12 is almost always going to be Ballistic Skill 12 and not further negatively modified. It also just randomly makes the Janbazan one of only a few models in a game that are just GoPod killers extraordinaire, and I like that. I like being able to completely murk a GoPod, because getting completely annihilated in one volley should be the natural fate of all GoPods, as a punishment to Nomad players for taking a relatively expensive piece that can't claim cover. Now, ultimately, we will discard the bulk of Janbazan profiles. We're not here for the hacker, we're not here for the doctor. This is Qapu Khalqi. We will get our fire team bonuses from other pieces, but the AP sniper rifle and the heavy machine gun are both potentially viable options. And while I think in absolute terms it's a fair appraisal of Janbazan to say that this is not a especially efficient profile, we have such efficient main firepower pieces that don't have things like visors that to complement them we want something that has, say, an MSV2. And so even though it is a slightly inefficient piece, the Janbazan's role in the army as the only MSV2 shooter that we have nevertheless makes it highly valuable. It's the kind of unit that wouldn't get a look in many other factions. Any faction, for example, that had access to things like an Intruder HMG would choose to take that instead. But we work with the tools that we've got, and in QK, that's the Janbazan, and so it's well worth taking for that reason. Now, jumping from Qapu Khalqi fire teams to Janissary fire teams, we have Janissaries. These guys picked up ballistic skill attack -3 in the N4 to N5 transition, and that collectively makes them just some really premium heavy infantry. Not quite no frills, but close enough. There is very little about these guys that isn't purely focused on, hey, this is a good gunfighting model. They're a little bit on the expensive side, but not untenably, and what we get for the package is proper ballistic skill 14 in a fire team. Excellent. Fizz 14, Willpower 14, both of which we could probably dispense with, but nice to have. Armor 4 and BTS 6, and proper 2 wounds. Excellent. This is a full heavy infantry chassis, and it's got ballistic skill attack -3. And all profiles have a heavy pistol, and there are a variety of viable profiles here. Now, my personal preference is to take just one Janissary with a big gun. For me, most of the time, that means the heavy machine gun also randomly has a pulsar. That's really nice. Takes the heavy machine gun and just spools up burst 5 on 14s with BS attack -3. But if you are looking for a dedicated ARO piece in this faction, you can really give some consideration to that missile launcher. It can be very difficult and annoying to try and suppress the Janissary missile. It's putting BS attack -3. It is relatively durable. It's also a religious troop. Now that has pros and cons, but it will stand and keep shooting if you wanted to. You just need to find a way to recover it, which is usually going to mean a sec ban who can join Janissary fire teams, and if you combine that with a Havsa, you have multiple different sources of 2 types of the same trooper. But that is a setup that I prefer with the heavy machine gun because the sec ban gives you NCO, which you are going to use repositioning a heavy machine gun for active turn firepower. You are not quite as likely to use the sec ban's NCO order repositioning a purely defensive missile launcher Janissary, but it is still well worth considering that the missile launcher exists. This is also a fire team that can be a core, so there is nothing stopping you from taking, for example, a Janissary HMG, a Janissary missile launcher, 2 Havsa, and a sec ban. That counts as having 4 of the same troop types because the Havsa count as Janissaries, which gets you to ballistic skill 15 and gives you an NCO order, a very dangerous dedicated ARO piece, a dangerous dedicated active piece. Like, that's just solid. Now, moving that around, 5-person fire team, a little bit tricky, especially given that they are 4-4. The whole fire team is 4-4, and that is the closest thing Janissaries have to a significant malice, apart from the fact that none of them have cubes. But willpower 17 doctors, you'll be fine. And so these guys kind of are our premium modifier heavy infantry gunfighters, and very good to have. Also, just kind of a call out for the Janissary Lieutenant with AP rifle, light shotgun, and firewall. Now, this is not an always trooper. Most of the time, you'll just take a Havsa as your lieutenant. But every now and again, there will be some kind of a mission or a scenario or some sort of pressure that makes you want to just have access to a lieutenant who can either fight or go active or do something like that. Maybe it's Biotech 4. Maybe it's a custom scenario like Hammer of Dawn, which is being played at Burn City Brawl in Australia in Melbourne later in this year. And if you decide that you need a lieutenant who can fight, and remember we have 20-point chain of command Havsas in this faction, then the Tinbot Janissary Lieutenant is your best choice in faction for that. So don't forget that that exists, even if most of the time we'll be taking one big gun Janissary and then a variety of support elements to fill out the fire team. Now, just as a final note, we aren't covering every possible fire team. We are not going to be covering Kaplan, for example. But for the sake of completeness, I will mention Drew's shock teams, which you will mostly run just as a network extension duo. I think these guys have primarily been obsoleted by Lashmi. She isn't quite as good at firing pitches as they are, but she's good enough and she joins fire teams so much more easily. But you can run a Drew's duo of just a pair of hackers, 23-point killer hackers, for example, and while they are not outstanding killer hackers, they have X-Visors and a ballistic skill 12 and pitches and are linked. They don't quite cross over into the threshold of truly efficient, because you do need to take 2 Drews, and that's 46 points for a pair of willpower 13 hackers. But if you absolutely want to just spam repeaters out everywhere, These guys can fire off 4 shots in a round before reloading passively off of a baggage bot at the end of turn. And with the special die, X-Visors and Ballistic Skill 12, they're pretty likely to hit 3 out of those 4 every given turn. Again, I think they are mostly obsoleted by Lashme, but they are something to consider, and some people will have a soft spot for them. And now, finally, Link team's kind of done with, let's talk about the Iguana. Boy howdy, what a glow up. Now, frankly, it's not really making a comparison before and after because we are concerned in this video with QK as they are now. And as they are now, the 64-point Iguana is one of the selling points of the faction. Now, the Iguana is a proper main battle tag. Tactical awareness, 6-4 movement, ballistic skill 14, only an AP heavy machine gun, not a multi-heavy machine gun, but it more than makes up with that by having secondary armaments in the form of a +1 burst heavy flamethrower and a mine dispenser. You've got plenty of access to baggage and incentive to add it into a list if you have a linked picture in QK, so you will often be able to use that mine dispenser to create layered equipment-only defenses by throwing out pitchers and mines, and just creating these little pockets of hell that are impossible for your opponent to get through at no cost. Now, all of that kind of by itself would be reasonably attractive, but it doesn't stop there. This is a model that has ECM Hacker, excellent, and is just packing a repeater. It's packing a repeater on both of its forms, which makes it an extremely durable repeater, and a repeater that is going to move around the board with a lot of mobility because it's 6-4 move and tactical awareness. If you need to move forward and hold a position, the Iguana can do that exceptionally by itself by moving up, laying some mines, being a repeater, and then having a heavy flamethrower and a gun that can go into suppressive fire. And it doubles down on that ability to hold position by being the only good model with an escape system in the entire game. Now, nominally, only Armor 6 BTS 6. That is low for any battle tag of this size, but it's transmutation. You get the first 3 wounds as the full tag form, and then once you've taken 3 wounds in that order, the escape system triggers, puts down an eclipse zone, and replaces the tag with the operator, which is basically just all of the same things as the tag. At that point, the way the structure/vitality system works, it effectively turns into a 1 wound, no wound incapacitation HI, which means that you have effectively about 5 wounds to play with on the Iguana, which is more than any other model in the entire game. Even the Gorgos in Toha does not have quite that level of resilience, although its armor is a little higher. And you keep the CM Hacker and you keep the repeater, your ballistic skill is only reduced to 13. Your first movement value is still 6, making you the only 6-2 heavy infantry, I think, in the faction. No, there's also Mobile Brigada, but they can't link and we don't care. Your close assault actually, in some respects, gets better because you don't have heavy flamethrowers, but you have a +1 burst light flamethrower and you have a +1 burst AP heavy pistol, which means that you can now fork that attack by going, do you want to dodge? If so, I'll hit you with this heavy pistol. And you still keep tactical awareness, and you're still a repeater, which means that the heavy infantry is doing enough of the work of the tag that this is basically a 5 wound model, and that's just really, really cool. Now, there are absolutely things that can pull an Iguana all the way to dead in 1 turn. Inside Qapu Khalqi, we have something like the Azrael, which is actually capable theoretically of doing enough wounds to put something like an Iguana down, perhaps over the course of 2 firefights, do 2 wounds and then do 3. That's very possible for a piece like an Azrael. Also, if it gets got in close combat, nothing was really going to save it. The fact that the Eclipse Zone pops is not really going to do anything for it, it's just going to make it easier to kill in CC. But with those very limited limitations, the fact that this is the most durable repeater in the game, on a solid fighting platform that is mobile and contributes to your defenses, and keeps going and going and going and holds a position is just collectively one of the selling points of QK. I have used this guy multiple times, totally unsurprisingly. He's the reason why I've finally been like, yes, now is the time for me to play Qapu Khalqi. And even in games where I have just pissed about and played him terribly, he has absolutely performed. There is a floor under the Iguana that is higher than many models in the game. Now, 64 points, you expect that to an extent, just a joy to play. Now, for my money, if you're getting into QK, I actually would say the Iguana shouldn't be your first purchase because I think the model looks a little bit like dog water, but happily the Scarface miniature is incredible with the resculpt. You can just buy him and use him as every Silhouette 4 Silhouette 7 tag you might use, and you might even occasionally use him as Scarface. Now, since we're talking about tags, I guess we should talk about all of them, or at least some of them. There are, however, 4 tags you can choose from in Qapu Khalqi. We have access to, in addition to the Iguana, Scarface and the Shakush and the Trip Hammer. You can do some very janky and amusing lists that play multiple tags, mostly as a, or exclusively as a meme. They are things to bear in mind, and Scarface is a piece that I have an affection for, even if, frankly, he is outcompeted by the Iguana in this faction. Still, just bear in mind, he is technically the best close combat model that we have, and there's nothing particularly wrong with him apart from the fact that he's just not as cool as an Iguana. I will also just very briefly mention both the Shakush and the Trip Hammer as tags that can duo and get duo bonuses. I don't think there are many lists where you realistically would try and do this. As much as a build your own pseudo HRMC is kind of fun, given the points differential between an Iguana and a Shakush is just not that high, at 6 points for the HMG version of the Shakush versus the Iguana, you're just going to take the Iguana most of the time. That puts pieces like Scarface and the Shakush more as a, I'm going to play more than one tag. And at that point, actually, I could genuinely see a Scarface and Iguana list just flexing on the tags in Qapu Khalqi. But most of the time, it's going to be the Iguana is the model that we are playing, and all of these extra tags are at best also Rans. Now, that's our fire team units, that's our tags talked about. Let's now talk about all of the interesting independent elements that don't form part of fire teams or our tags in Qapu Khalqi, of which there are plenty, and we're going to start with the Yarn Yarns. These guys have been part of the core identity of QK kind of forever, and their fortunes have waxed and waned significantly over time. In N5, they are in a good spot. Now, most of the time, these are just kind of like utility warbands. They have Fizz 14 and smoke grenades. That can often be all that they are present for. They throw some smoke down to get you up the field or to allow your Jambazans to shoot through smoke. That might be all they do, and you paid 6 points for that, and that is totally fine. They do have a little bit of performance spike potential, though, mostly off the back of, okay, they can combat jump. Most of the time, you probably don't want to combat jump or parachute these guys. I have tried it. More experienced QK players will have an eye for when that is the right play. I've even had some good results occasionally, but in practice, what I have found is that I mostly want to treat these guys as regular warbands with little spikes of mobility thanks to super jump jet propulsion. This makes them effectively 6/4 warband pieces because they have perfect maneuverability with jet propulsion. They just get the extra move from declaring super jump. And that lets them go places and do things that other warbands sometimes can't. Now, where they struggle is capitalizing on that. They are CC22, but with no martial arts or special CC skills. They have a chain rifle and a heavy pistol. Usually it's the heavy pistol profile that you will take, the cheapest one. But that does sometimes put them in a position where their lethality just leaves a little bit to be desired. But they're 6 points. They're 6 points, and there's a limit to how much you can expect. And thanks to Booty, they sometimes just randomly roll up 4 armor or a HMG, or on a very good day, grenades, and then you have a Fizz 14 grenade trooper that is super jumping forward into a position. In fact, the best performing Yarn Yarn that I have personally had was one that rolled up grenades and killed a Kahu duo, a motorized bounty hunter, and a Fugazi drone bot just lobbing grenades over different walls. So you have a very variable performance profile with these guys, but just at minimum, chain rifle, 6 points, super jump jet propulsion, and smoke grenades. Very happy with that. You should usually have a couple of these in any given QK list. They are cheap, they will do effective things. Just bear in mind that if you really absolutely need to kill something, these guys are at best going to be okay in close combat and at best going to be okay at forcing trades with chain rifles, and they are more of a utility and mobility piece than a real killer. Next up, a model that you will actually want to use, usually parachutist, very occasionally combat jump, is Bashi Bazooks. Now, Bashis were a profile that kind of occupied a firm position in the jank tank for most of Infinity's life cycle that they've been around, because Holo Projector and Holo Mask just do be that way. What has changed for them in N5 is that they've gotten combat jump, but they've retained parachutist, and those are not skills that are badly overcosted anymore. And this has allowed a bunch of changes to the general profile, just the addition of weapons that make them a competent attack piece. There are a number of pieces here that you could theoretically consider. My personal favorite is the Contender +1 burst, Boarding Pistol +1 burst. What you have here are a few things. Firstly, that is a 3-dice Contender that can just walk on in something's back arc and fire off 3 shots with T2 rounds, and just randomly score a kill, thanks to, even on heavy infantry, thanks to those T2 shots. If it has to get up close, notwithstanding the range bands of the Contender, you can just transfer your fighting over to the Boarding Pistol, which can be used either as a burst 3 attack at close range or a burst 2 template. Now, at ballistic skill 11, that isn't setting the world on fire, but if you are taking really advantageous attacks thanks to being a parachutist or a drop troop, you will have situations where your low ballistics doesn't matter because the trade that you are threatening with a 2 template boarding pistol template attack is just really, really good. These guys are one of those pieces where they are absolutely going to be games where your opponent is able to just stop them from turning up, or trade them out for a deployment zone template piece or something like that. But they are so cheap at like 14 to 16 points. That's the same price that some other factions might pay for an entire warband model. That the floor for their performance is that they make a reasonable trade and die, and the ceiling for their performance is that with relatively few orders, they kill something that's much more expensive than they are. And I have a lot of time for that. The only thing that would make Bashi Bazooks absolutely perfect, and which they don't have, is that despite being a combat jump model, they don't have super jump jet propulsion, but given how much else they've got going on, I can't really be too mad about that. Also, don't forget that they have Armor 2, which if they're in cover, randomly will save their life against stuff like Combi Rifle return fire. And if you get the opportunity, absolutely do use the Hollow Mask, Hollow Projector in particular, to sweep out and clear enemy mines. Now, these guys are not a profile you should put in every single list because, mostly for scenario reasons, sometimes you just won't have space, you'll need to be doing other things, especially in very demanding scenarios, like stuff like evacuation, for example. You are often just going to need every single order spent doing the scenario or fighting your opponent. That having, say, a parachutist off the board for a couple of turns and then coming in to do a trade doesn't fit well into the rhythm of play for that scenario. But despite that, look, a lot of the time, Bashi Bazooks, they just offer such a high roll potential. Their performance spikes can be so good, and their performance floor is totally reasonable for a 14-point model. I like them a lot and do not sleep on them in this edition. Not a model for every single list, but a model for many. Next up, and in a pretty similar vein, we have Corsan, Corsairs of the Gate. Now, that's a lot of profile. I want you to ignore all of them except for the very last one. Corsan don't link particularly easily in QK. The FTOs are technically wildcards, but they are one of and nothing else counts as a Corsan. So basically all of this is not particularly relevant. You might get some mileage potentially out of the cheap drop bear profile, but I'm not really here for that. What I am here for is a parachutist deployment zone. That's a really, really powerful skill. Now, Corsan capitalize on it okay. There are more powerful deployment zone parachutists in the game. Absolutely, there are more powerful. But there aren't any that cost 21 points. In fact, in terms of models that do that kind of thing, either parachutist deployment zone or impersonation, which are sort of comparable skills, the Corsan is the cheapest in the entire game. The only thing that is comparable is a Greif operator, and it's carrying an SWC cost. The Corsan is not. And the Corsan is theoretically availability 3. Probably don't take 3 of those, but you can absolutely run lists that have a pair of deployment zone parachutist Corsans that just attack, attack, attack off the back of, like, the first one exploits gaps the second one makes. And they're not terrible at making those gaps. They're not fantastic, right? There are limitations here, but they've got ballistic skill attack -3 and boarding shotguns. They've also got CC attack -3 and CC 21, which is probably not something I want to use terribly much, but you could do something like run them into close combat to tie an enemy model up and then leave them there. That's a way to neutralize an ARO that you could genuinely consider. Most of the time, you'll want to be trying to find people out of cover using a combination of 6-2 move, parachutist deployment zone, and climbing plus, and take 2 dice on 17's boarding shotgun attacks against someone ideally that is dodging on a -6 because of the zone of control penalty and ballistic skill attack -3. and just trying to do damage and make a mess. Now, where these guys will falter is just against a really prepared opponent that is able to stop them walking on at all, or just have templates in place to trade out for them. 21 points is not like a Bashi Bazook at 14, right? A Bashi Bazook can take that trade and be reasonably comfortable that they have sold their lives in a worthwhile sense. 21 points for Corsair's a little bit more difficult to be comfortable in that, but the high watermark of performance for any parachutist deployment zone is it won me the game, and so they're well worth considering for that reason. Finally, we get to our midfield infiltration elements, of which there are two in QK. The first and the most common is the Al-Hawa unit. Now, there are some advantages and disadvantages to these guys that position them as an okay midfielder. But having at least an okay midfielder in numbers is still a nice thing to have. It's just worth being aware that when we start talking about the Hawa, this is where the limitations of QK begin to expose themselves. Now, I like these profiles, but they've got kind of a ceiling to their performance. Ballistic skill 11 is just not going to do terribly much. It's very easy for that to let you down, and so don't really think about these guys as assault elements, but they are midfield specialists, and there are lots of scenarios where having midfield specialists is good. I personally particularly like, well, frankly, either of the hacking profiles, but the killer hacker is often one I will take most, because I have Lashmi and Layla Sharif to do my regular kinds of hacking. And while they are BTS 0, which is a little bit frightening to go after an enemy hacker with, they are willpower 14, they have surprise attack, they have killer hacking devices, that is plenty fine for attacking through a pitcher that Lashmi has laid and securing a kill. They've also got dechargers and cyber mines, both of which actually are kind of nice to have. Cyber mines are very serviceable in this edition if you need to just secure a location. I've used these guys in scenarios like Bipong, for example, to crawl forward to an objective, lay a mine on the way, just make them a little bit more annoying to dislodge than they might otherwise be, and they're willpower 14 specialists. There is absolutely nothing at all wrong with that, and decharges can even occasionally do a classified, or might even be able to lay a decharge on the occasional immobilized enemy unit. Mostly though, 22 points, willpower 14 midfield specialist who contributes to your hacking game, that is totally fine. Where these guys sort of begin to fall down a little bit is I would love to have access to a pre-laid minefield, and the mine layer profiles are a little bit bloated. 21 points is not the end of the world, neither is 22, but you are paying for things you're not going to use terribly much. Ballistic skill 11 grenade launchers, I mean, on a Jackal, that's excellent. On a 21-point Al-Hawa, less so. The Shock Marksman Rifle, kind of the same deal. You will occasionally get kills your opponent did not expect by having a model on a rooftop stand up and back shoot something. Cool, yep, fair enough. But 22 points for a model that is mostly going to be a random order generator and a mine layer is just, it's less efficient than many of the very efficient things QK otherwise has access to. Still, we don't have that much choice in QK when it comes to midfield, and so for that reason, any of the specialist Hawaii profiles, be it the 19-point cheap as chips forward observer, the 22-point killer hacker, right, any of these might see play, because willpower 14 midfield specialists is just a highly valuable role to have filled in an army. Now we're going to go through two more pieces, kind of vanity picks, but worth considering. One of them is freelance operator Samsa. This guy is in a really weird grab bag of factions, but he's being mentioned here because he is your only piece apart from Al-Hawa with infiltration, and sometimes that will be relevant. He is technically an infiltrating specialist. He does not have camouflage, he's got decoy instead, which can leave him a little bit exposed, but he's a ballistic skill 13, mimetism 3 plasma rifle. By this point in the channel's life cycle, I feel like I should not need to extol the virtues of plasma. It is the most joyous ammunition to use in the game. And Samsa, he has a significant tendency to do something really cool and then die. And especially if you're going second and you need a midfield specialist, the Hawa is just a much more consistent option. But Plasma and 6-2 move super jump is extremely cool. So Samsa is a model that you should bear in mind as a, I've got 26 points left in this list. What can I spend that on? That's the exact kind of case where Samsa is a model that, since you have already filled all of your other bases, right, since you've covered everything that you need to, if you can then squeeze Samsa in, and you will sometimes be able to, that's when he's a really cool piece to include. Finally, More expensive and more of a build around, but a piece I want to cover in at least one of these videos is Fiddler, Aristea's ex-toy maker. Now, this weird kind of thing happened in N5, where we had a period at the beginning of the edition where Coming Plus was kind of just bad and didn't work particularly well. And between that and the fact that Vulcan shotguns no longer had template modes, a lot of people just sort of wrote Fiddler off as bad. And then Corvus Belli fixed Coming Plus, and now it works really nicely again. And no one's really come back to reevaluating pieces like her. Now, yes, it is still absolutely true that Vulcan shotguns don't have template modes anymore. However, do you want to know what kills things really effectively? Just running Vulcan shotguns at them and having multiple models making rolls against them so that they can't face-to-face all of them except by dodging, and you just kill them with armor-piercing continuous damage shots anyway. Now, 43 points for the full kit of Fiddler is expensive, but we were just talking about how the Iguana is an awesome model at 64 points, in part because it's bringing 5 effective wounds to the table. Now, there is a very big armor difference, but Fiddler is effectively 4 wounds for 43 points. That's not a bad ROI. And she's dangerous, and you absolutely can still have situations where she rounds the corner and just absolutely murks things with a combination of her own gunfighting and the jackbots. Now, you need to be a little bit careful there because, yes, your opponent will usually try and zero out her because if she dies, the jackpots go down. But she can put 7 dice into an enemy between her Burst 3 contender and each of the jackpot's Burst 2 Vulcan shotguns. And there's basically like one thing in the entire game that can come close to matching or exceeding that, and that is Drummers in Panoceania. And do you want to know what's more vulnerable to a face-to-face roll against the controller than Fiddler? It's single wound drummers. Fiddler at least has no wound incapacitation and critical immunity, which makes her very difficult to put down with just a random combi rifle coming back at her, or even something like an armor-piercing round from an AP HMG. She's very good, thanks to critical immunity, at surviving one face-to-face roll, and that lets her, at relatively low risk, put 7 dice into the enemy, and again, we're talking things in this faction that are a threat even to Jotuns. She's also a specialist because she's an engineer. Because she's an engineer, you can start doing things like putting a total reaction bot into the list. And finally, thanks to being 6-4 move and climbing plus, she's highly mobile in a way that especially your link teams in this faction aren't. Because we got lots of 4-4 models in our fire teams, often the only things that we are really efficiently attacking with in QK are either Yan-Yans or the tag. And so if you can find the points for her, having Fiddler as a rapid offensive unit fills a gap that otherwise there aren't necessarily things that easily do that inside QK. Now, ultimately, 43 points is a lot of points. It can be difficult to find that in this faction without making some significant cuts. Often it'll mean downgrading or displacing perhaps one of your fire teams, which you may not want to do. But just keep an eye on her as an element for inclusion, because probably more in QK than in just about any of the factions she can otherwise join, that ability to move quickly with mobility into the midfield and absolutely slam something lets you make plays that you can't easily do otherwise in QK. And with that, let's jump into our showcased list for QK to round out the episode. Now, this version of the list is a very slight change to one that has featured previously on the channel in a game of Qapu Khalqi versus Kestrel Colonial Force in Bpong. And it's basically just making some light tweaks in order to fit in a Bashi Bazook, which I wanted to include, and which has performed well in the games that I've used it in. That does come with the cost of having probably a few more irregulars than I would like, which really strains command tokens in this list. You will often consider, for example, not using Speedball because you will be converting Yan-Yan orders a lot. And if you want to have a cleaner regular count, all you need to do is cut the Bashi Bazook and a Yan-Yan. Those points can easily be spent on cheap regular orders like a Shakush pilot, which will benefit the Iguana. Another Fanus remote, that'll let you get the Azrael back up to a Feuerback, and you'll have at that point a really clean regular order count. But I am a Bashi convert in N5, so the Bashi is in. Just be aware that that's a limitation on the list. So what we have here is starting completely unsurprisingly with an Iguana. It is really good. I would not be doing you justice if I didn't put an Iguana in a showcase list because it's a showcase piece for the faction. It can, in this list, duo with Layla Sharif, Don't feel like that's mandatory, but if this is a mission that you're playing it in where you have to get specialists up towards midfield buttons, for example, we've got a number of options to do that, but one of the ways is to use the Iguana's tactical awareness order as it's laying some mines to get Layla forward. Much of the rest of the time, you can easily just leave her in the back of the deployment zone, where she serves as a Sixth Sense effective hacker, denying stealth, etc., for all of the reasons we've spoken about. We've then got a three-person Qapu Khalqi fire team, consisting of an Azrael, a Sekban Doctor, and a Havsa. In this version of the list, after a little bit of testing, I have found that I prefer for this configuration the Azrael AP HMG. It's been a little bit more consistent, it mostly takes long-range gunfights, because our close assault needs are being borne by the Yan Yans, the Bashi Bazooka, etc. And it combines nicely, as you would expect, with the Sekban Doctor and the Havsa. Just to note, if you need to have the Sekban somewhere else for some reason, you absolutely can. You can have Layla Sharif join that team instead, and then it's Azrael, Layla Sharif, and a Havsa. That's a two-person team because of the Gulams, the Havsa and Layla Sharif, still giving you the bonuses to the Azrael. And if you need to free up points elsewhere, that's one of the ways you can free up like 23 points in this list. I like the Sekban, but this team doesn't need to move around terribly much. So you can dispense with the NCO order, and 23 points gets you things like, for example, a Al-Hawa in the midfield. We've got one Hawa though, it's a Hawa KHD. It forms part of our hacking network. I think the ideal, like, minimum good quality investment in hacking in N5 is 2 models that can do Trinity and 2 models that can do regular hacking. And with Layla Sharif, Ahawa, and Lashmi, who we'll see in Group 2, you've got all of those covered. We've then got one Fanus. Now, there will be 3 deployment zone repeaters in this list because we have the Iguana, 1 Fanus, and 1 Camille. That's enough to give you basically total deployment zone coverage, but if we do things like cut the Bashi Bazook and a Yan Yan, we will usually get another deployment zone repeater in, which is kind of nice just for defenses. You will note that there's nothing like any total reaction bots in this list. The defense is kind of thin. Against a really dedicated attack by a heavy enemy, we're hoping to stop them with a combination of things like sacrificial Yan Yans and hacking at close range. You have to keep your hackers alive through enemy countermeasures for that reason. Use depth to defend them, keep them in positions where they can't easily have a pitcher dropped on their head, because our defenses here are limited and occasionally a bit sacrificial. We've then got 2 Yan Yans and a Bashi Bazook. 3 irregulars is a lot in this combat group. That's why I'm talking about one of the ways you can change this is to get more regulars in. But I love me warbands and I love me Bashi, and they've done good work in game so far. Combat Group 2, we've got a fire team that consists of a Janbazan, Lashmi, and a Havsa. Now, if you can find points in this list, one of the things you could genuinely consider doing is cutting the Janbazan. I like it, and it does do smoke shooting, and we have lots of smoke in this list, but a really nice piece to change it with just for consistency, not being bound to Ballistic Skill 12 and a bit more robustness, is not terribly much more expensive to get a Janissary into that position instead. You need to find 7 points, which is going to require doing things like maybe trimming the midfield back a little bit, perhaps cutting the Sekban. That's a way to do it. And that gets you a proper big gun ballistic skill 14, 5 dice, ballistic skill attack -3, which is its own negative modifier and is extremely serviceable for doing things like downing enemy TR bots, just as a consideration instead of the Janbazan. I like smoke shooting, but you can absolutely change it with competing pieces if you can find the points in this list. We then have Lashmi and a Havsa. That Havsa is our lieutenant, but either of the 2 Havsas could be your LT if you want to change things up, if your opponents get used to your lists. And because Lashmi and a Havsa are both wildcards who count as Odalisks, anything that they join gets that fire team bonus. Finally, we have another Yan Yan, taking us up to the maximum AVA of 3 in QK. Remember, again, you can easily cut down to 2 Yan Yans and still be fine. And a Camille, you do absolutely want baggage in lists like this, because Lashmi and the Iguana both benefit a lot from being able to reload. Some of the games I've had with QK, where it's been just a bit more difficult than I'd like to attack into a really well-defended opponent, I have gotten through them by just making a hellscape in the midfield of mines and repeaters, which has forced my opponent to unpack and expend resources dealing with stuff that is ultimately replaceable and free, which has finally allowed openings for me to grapple with them. Things like Kestrel, for example, in N5 just defend tremendously well off the back of cheap, effective Jackal mine layers and good quality gunfighters everywhere, and I've found some success in really just forcing them to come forward and grapple with all of your bullshit before they can get to the squishy center, and so baggage is just really useful in having endless supplies of that bullshit to throw out. It's not the early N4 era of turret spam, but it is still very good, and it fits QK really well. Overall, this list is the kind of list I was talking about when I was rattling off all of the things you can fit in a QK list in N5. Multiple big guns, good quality hacking, network projection, tons of deployables, loads of warband pieces, a decent quality midfield specialist, a parachutist, a main battle tag. Like, there's so much that's going on in here that even if you lose one or two pieces, you've still got loads of capability to fall back on. And there's basically no mission up to and including Biotech 4 that I would say this couldn't do. I think it's a good showcase of some of the awesome stuff that QK can do, the flexibility and the breadth of options QK have in this edition, and I hope it's given you a little bit of incentive to give them a look. Now, that wraps up this video. Closing out as usual, go ahead and like and subscribe, and if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member at any of the 3 channel member levels on YouTube. We cover multiple war games, but Infinity is the main one. We'll have Infinity content basically every week, and so with that said, I hope very much that you've enjoyed this, and I will see you next week for more Infinity videos.